Welcome to the show tonight. The recording is our third installment in this series we're working through, which is a long kind of story arc. We're kind of working through the Enlightenment and a whole host of concepts associated with the Enlightenment and their impact on education. And then we're going to move forward through modernity, and we're going to talk about more recent events, and we're going to be able to situate all of this in a much deeper context. Basically, that's the idea of the series. Part 3 is based on the following essay that I published a few days ago, or about a week ago almost now at this point. This essay entitled The Enlightenment, Gnosticism and Modern Education, and that is over on Substack. And if you would do me a massive favour and go over there and subscribe over there. Substack is great. You'll find all kinds of interesting people on there. And if you follow my Substack, you know, I will be doing other stuff, and I've other projects as well that I've planned out, and I've began researching and everything. So that will be an ongoing kind of project for me. And of course, I also have, in addition to YouTube, I have an X account. Haven't started tweeting yet, but I probably will. Honestly, I'm starting to get the hang of X. I'm starting to connect with different people on there now. And of course, I have Rumble and I have Odyssey, and the links for all of that is in the description of this video. So tonight's presentation is based on that essay, but it's a very kind of deep subject. This is going to build on the earlier installment, and we're going to start looking at those earlier ideas in the context of this conception of Gnosticism, of theology, and its impact on modernity. So to summarize very briefly, part 2 covered the classical education and the West, the 7 liberal arts, the trivium and all that, scholasticism, and we discussed the impact of the Enlightenment and how that represented a kind of a break with a lot of that earlier tradition. And we discovered this kind of, there was a new consciousness. Man had a new consciousness. Man was essentially matter, and essentially he had to take in charge his own direction. And this brought us to a brief discussion of the French encyclopedists, Helvetius, and we discovered how that was premised upon a desire to basically draw a line with the past and just draw from the knowledge which was declared to be useful and correct was extracted, and all this earlier knowledge was kind of considered to be redundant. And this is had a major impact on the future. This led us then to discussing liberal Christianity and secular ideologies as a kind of a secularized religiosity, basically. So this was all about a kind of the search for a system to organize society rationally, and of course that led to a desire to construct morality and ethics rationally as well, which we'll discover later in the series when we talk about humanism, particularly progressive ideology, 20th century developments, and that'll be very interesting. So this is kind of the groundwork for all of that, and it's going to give us a much deeper and richer understanding. So this kind of new scientific and naturalist religion was associated with the Enlightenment. This created the environment for utopianism and romanticism, and we discussed that, and particularly with the guy who's pictured there in the thumbnail to part 2, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. We discussed a number of the followers of Rousseau, and we critiqued some of these ideologies of the Enlightenment and of the French Enlightenment under some useful philosophy from people like Eric Voegelin and Isaiah Berlin. We finished up then with a discussion of some English progressive educators who were influenced by that, and this is very prescient because of what we're going to talk about a little bit later in this presentation. But what the main theme that initiated that second essay was this idea that there was a crisis in modernity and the crisis of the Enlightenment, basically. And Eric Voegelin was the guy we used to discuss that in that second essay, and that's him pictured there. And Voegelin argued that God was replaced by new secular forms of authority, managers, legislators, and educators, to name a few. And the assumption that all earlier knowledge was backward was continued. And of course, this was essentially the main conception of progress flowed from the Enlightenment. And tonight we're going to discuss where progress really comes from, and the concept of progress and where it really comes from. And we're going to use a slightly more deep analysis tonight. We're going to go a bit deeper on some of those themes we discussed. So we're going to open up here with Carl Schmitt, who was the famous German jurist and political theorist in the early 20th century. He's most famously known for several books. We're only going to draw from one of his books tonight, which is all about this theme of secularized theology. He was a member of the National Socialist Party in Germany during the early 20th century, mid 20th century. He's constantly derided for that. But Carl Schmitt is a seminal and very important intellectual in the development of the West, and cannot be ignored. Simply, you need to read these people, and you need to have an idea of what they were talking about. So he argued that the modern state was derived from secular theological concepts, in which the omnipotent God became the omnipotent lawgiver. So what he's saying there is what we just articulated a bit earlier there, which is that man became God with the Enlightenment. Man took in charge his evolution and was determined to create a new world. And this will be the theme of our presentation moving forward tonight as we move into education. So Schmitt argued that the metaphysical origin of the concept of sovereignty evolved across the 17th and 18th centuries, where it was incorporated into the new naturalistic and scientific language of the Enlightenment. So he is not saying that we made this clean break, essentially. He's saying that there was a continuation and people lost the understanding of where these concepts came from. So Thomas Hobbes and his concept of the Leviathan state, the sole sovereign, to which all men should give their true allegiance, basically. And we'll talk about him in another installment when we talk about a few other people like Hegel and everything. But he had this idea of the Leviathan, and Schmitt considered this to be deeply rooted in mythology. So here's Schmitt on writing on Rousseau. He said, "The politicization of theological concepts, especially with respect to the concept of sovereignty, is so striking that it has not escaped any true expert on his writings," that is Rousseau. Rousseau applies to the sovereign the idea that the philosophers hold of God. He may do anything that he wills, but he may not will evil. So he's essentially saying there that Rousseau considers man to be God. And that's the book, Political Theology. So this brings us to the late 19th and early 20th century Germany, which is where our work tonight is going to be based on work that was produced in that period, basically. And we're going to look back on it and discover what exactly they were trying to understand and trying to articulate. And all of the intellectuals we discussed tonight do not hold the exact same view, but what they do provide us with is a really rich understanding of the changes that have occurred in modernity, and a potential set of concepts, or a potential set of categories which may be useful in describing our current malaise. So in that period, Germany was in a state of philosophical crisis, basically. A lot of intellectuals at the time were writing about this, and of course we're talking here about a crisis of liberalism, secularism and rationalism, which is associated with the Enlightenment. And so there was a feeling that it had kind of burnt out. And so Nietzsche is the most famous kind of critic of all of this, and he said, of course, that the West was a spent force, basically, and had no vitality. So some of the intellectuals who were discussing these kinds of ideas at the time were people like George Simmel, and of course the Frankfurt School popped up in the early 20th century, and they had the whole critical theory, and of course Max Horkheimer and the Frankfurt School and their critical theory was drawing upon work carried out by Max Weber, in the sociologist, basically, in the 19th century. He saw in the degenerated state of the German educational system the deterioration of the German heritage or of culture, and the moulding the character of the individual through education, and a reflection of the same deep-rooted crisis, basically. So Max Weber saw that there was a degeneration going on in German culture, and it was a reflection of the same crisis, basically. Now, Weber's thesis was essentially not the same as all of these other men, but he did believe that there was a crisis. The new German thought really begins most directly with Hans Jonas. Now, Hans Jonas wrote a number of books, but I cite from one of them in the essay. But basically, so you had this general agreement among these intellectuals, including Jonas, that there was this crisis of modernity derived from essentially a spiritual source, and this inspired a whole slew of intellectuals to discover the origins of Christianity, and in particularly to look at the Apostle Paul. And that's very notable because we'll discuss why in a moment. But basically, Hans Jonas's 1928 dissertation, Gnosis and the Spirit of Late Antiquity, basically was the first kind of big text in this way. It was supervised by Martin Heidegger, the famous German intellectual, philosopher, father of existentialism, and Rudolf Bultmann. We're not going to discuss Heidegger in this installment. We may come to him later on in the series. This new generation of German intellectuals that were developing at this time, they had some similar ideas. So they were interested essentially in this conception of gnosis or apocalypticism, or the effect, at the very least, at the effect of theology on modernity. And so the four intellectuals who are relative here, two of which we're really going to draw upon, the other two not so much, was the aforementioned Hans Jonas, who's photographed, who we'll mention in a second, and then Eric Voegelin is the other big one, who really his kind of work on Gnosticism is more kind of fleshed out in terms of modern political thought and of the effect of theology on history in the modern period. Gershom Scholem, he is a Jewish theologian, and he wrote a lot about things like rabbinical Judaism and Kabbalah and things like that as well. And this guy called Hans Blumenberg, who we don't really draw upon, but who was had a kind of a different approach to a lot of these things. So this is one of Jonas's books. It's called The Gnostic Religion. And essentially the inherent meaning of Gnosticism, the word comes from the Greek word for gnosis, or knowledge, or gnosis, basically, knowledge or insight, which is gnosis. And it's associated most deliberately with the 1st and 2nd centuries BC, the Hermetic philosophy, basically, the Corpus Hermeticum, the Jewish apocalyptic writings, Platonic philosophy, and the Hebrew scriptures. So that's the kind of classical idea of what Gnosticism was. And Jonas said Gnosis had, quote, an emphatically religious and supernatural meaning, and refers to objects which we nowadays should call those of faith rather than of reason. So Gnosticism is not really a rational belief. It is an inherently metaphysical approach to existence. A quote here from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which I thought was kind of a good kind of starting point to kind of begin. There is an irreparable rupture between the realm of experience, pathos, and the realm of true being, that is, existence in its positive, creative, or authentic aspect. So, similar to Greek philosophy, there is a dichotomy between the realm of true, unchanging being and ever-changing becoming. And essentially, there's a rejection of the material world, which is seen as fallen, and essentially we are distant from the transcendent. And so instead of constructing a kind of a philosophy which kind of unites the two, Gnosticism tends to increase the difference between these two ideas and two realms, and to basically involve radical dualism, basically, so the amplification of these differences. And of course this leads then to the creation of a mythological doctrine of humankind's origin in the realm of being, and eventual fall into the realm of darkness or matter, that is, becoming. So we basically are in a fallen world, and essentially the Gnostics myth of Sophia, wisdom, who created the demiurge, who is the evil architect of the material realm. We are in the prison created by the demiurge, basically, and we must transcend the material world and return to salvation. Now that's a very kind of top-down basic explanation of what Gnostic thought was, and it expressed itself in the pagan world, and it was fought in the pagan world as well to an extent. It was driven out, and it emerged again in Christianity as well, and it was fought off, and it was purged from the early church, basically. But Voegelin and others argue, particularly Voegelin argues, that there was a return to Gnosticism in the following the Enlightenment in particular, and we're going to explain how he argues that, and a few others argue that had happened. There was another Irish intellectual who wrote a lot about Gnosticism as well, Gerald Hanratty, who I believe was a priest, but he was a philosopher, and he wrote quite a bit. He wrote a number of essays about this very problem in the 80s and 90s in particular. So Hans Jonas believed that the most pervasive dualism in Gnosis is not theological opposition between two or more or less equal divine principles, one good, one evil, but an existential dualism rooted in the Gnostics' feeling of estrangement from the cosmos. So that's a summation of Jonas's thought on the kind of underlying psychology of Gnosticism. Now, Other people who wrote a lot about Gnosticism and used it symbolically were people like Carl Jung, for example. We're not going to go into Carl Jung here, but Carl Jung was very, very heavily influenced by Gnostic thought. He wrote a whole book about it, I believe. But basically, Jonas is arguing here that the real kind of psychological basis of Gnostic thought is actually the estrangement that we feel from the cosmos. The fact that we are small, that we are insignificant, that we feel like we're not connected to anything. And Gnosticism tends to emerge from that kind of psychological kind of situation. Disbelief in the world and estrangement from it are the symbol of the Gnostic existential state of mind in its quest for self-revelation and redemption. So here is Eric Voegelin. This is from Order and History, Volume 5, Volume 4, The Ecumenic Age, which is probably his best. Well, I haven't read all of his work, but this is really good. This is one that's considered the one that a lot of people would recommend you read if you don't read any of them. But I wouldn't start there maybe, but it's very, very good. And he says, if he's talking here about the effect that a Gnostic frame of mind would have on a society or on a civilization. So he says, if life in the cosmos was indeed life in a daemonic prison, and daemonic doesn't mean demonic, it means a lesser god. It means like the demiurge is a lesser god than the true god. So in the Gnostic sense, he's talking about the demiurge. If life in the cosmos was indeed life under the demiurge or in a daemonic prison, man's ordering of existence in this kind of world was reduced to the preparation of his escape from it. In particular, he had to acquire the knowledge, gnosis, that would enable his personal pneuma or spirit to return in death to the divine pneuma. Consistently, the program could, as it did in certain instances, lead to the formation of communities of men and women who would live and die without offspring, in the hope that the communities would continue until all human beings had joined them, so that all human pneuma or spirits would be returned to the divine pneuma through the extinction of mankind. So what he's explaining there is that Gnostic thought is essentially a death cult. It leads to a frame of mind which views the world as inherently evil and inherently about it must be destroyed in order to bring about a kind of a reconnection with source or with the true God, basically. So it inherently is sterile. It doesn't encourage the formation of families, the creation of sustaining societies or civilization, certainly. So it's inherently dead. It leads to a lot of nihilism. It's a very nihilistic worldview, really. So that's the kind of classical conception of Gnosticism and its effects. So another source that I used for this in trying to understand this kind of concept was this book called The Tree of Gnosis. And this book is actually quite critical of the Gnostic kind of thesis or explanation for modernity, but it has a lot of really good information in there. And this book argues that the first kind of really modern use of this idea to explain modern philosophy was in 1835 by this guy called Ferdinand Christian Bauer, who essentially compared modernity to Gnosticism and said that Hegel really was comparable to Valentinus, the 2nd century Christian Gnostic. So he says, for him, Hegel is the heir to Valentinus. In Valentinianism, the absolute spirit is the top of the pyramidal pleroma, and the aeons are the essences through which the spirit knows itself by creating a negative reflection of itself. The link between he's basically comparing Hegel's system, which we'll discuss in a later essay, to Gnostic thought. And if you know much about Hegel, Hegel was really steeped in Hermeticism and Kabbalism, and really his system really does resemble essentially a kind of a very Gnostic, Hermetic kind of philosophy. But anyway, the link between aeons is love, and all of this returns in Hegel, as well as Sophia's fall, which takes on the form of a break in the kingdom of the Son of the world, when the finite spirit appears, which is the equivalent of the Valentinian low-quality psyche or soul. The kingdom of the Son of the world will be concluded by the dialectic negation of the negation, a process of reconciliation in which the absolute spirit recognizes itself for what it is. So Hegel's whole philosophy basically is premised on this idea that we're going to help God realize himself and know himself, that we have a central action in history in helping God see himself and recognize himself and essentially complete history. But that's a subject we'll return to another night. So this brings us to another intellectual called Karl Lewit, and he ended up, I think, in the New School for Social Research. And he was another student of Martin Heidegger. And he wrote a 1949 book called Meaning in History. And he basically says that modernity is secularized theology, which is a similar thesis to the aforementioned Carl Schmitt. So for Voegelin, Scholem, Jonas, and Blumenberg, so the four kind of main German kind of guys who were kind of articulating this new Gnostic kind of idea, Lewit's thesis was crucial because it made the history of modernity a sign of human inability to overcome theology, not only because modern times emerged out of the medieval era, as Lewit suggested, but more profoundly because within modern secular patterns of thought and political life, i.e. within human action in history, lies a primeval theological underlayer, which was exactly Carl Schmitt's concept of political theology from the 1920s. So basically, modernity has not escaped. We are not in this perfectly rational world whatsoever. As a matter of fact, a lot of these Enlightenment philosophers are steeped in Hermeticism and alchemy and all the rest of it. So we're going to have to develop then a coherent understanding of how Gnosticism might emerge in modernity. So Jacob Taubes, he wrote a 1947 doctoral thesis, which was later published in English, and Taubes makes no distinction between apocalypticism and Gnosticism. So I think Voegelin does a similar thing, to be fair. I think Voegelin takes a very similar view. He kind of rolls a lot of apocalyptic ideas, I think, into his version of Gnosticism, or what he thinks Gnosticism emerges as in modern times. But the important thing that I want you to take from this whole kind of work is not so much that it is Gnosticism and you have to accept that. It's more to get you to consider that a lot of modernity is, in fact, inherently our continuation of earlier religious tradition. And a lot of these secular movements and political, Voegelin called them political religions. These 19th century revolutionary movements, a lot of them are basically political religions, he argues. And I think that's correct. I think that's the correct way. If you want to view this as a continuation of Christian eschatology, apocalypticism, or Gnosticism, you won't find really any argument from me. I'm interested in how these categories help us to understand the modern world and education and what we're living through. So Taubes makes no distinction between apocalypticism and Gnosticism. For him, to put it in his own words, Gnosticism is the historical ideology of apocalyptic revolution, which manifests itself in Jesus' preaching of the imminent coming of the kingdom of God. Through Jesus' death and resurrection, this world is abolished, yet it is slow to disappear. St. Paul is the first to give this paradox Gnostic expression by moving Christian salvation from the horizontal dimension of time to the vertical dimension of being, by transforming the end of the world into an individual escape from the prison of the world. And St. Paul is very important because St. Paul really is the father of modern Gnosticism in many respects. Eric Voegelin basically took a lot from Lewit and Taubes. He argued that the modern period of Western civilization, particularly that which followed the Enlightenment, could be best understood as the successive resurgence of Gnosticism. Voegelin argued that Christianity was a revolutionary religion which rejected polytheism and de-divinized the physical world. Salvation now lay out of reach and it was a matter of faith. So the modern Gnostics sought a shortcut by transforming the beyond into this world. This is what he describes it as. So what we're describing here is turning the physical world that we live in into heaven, into the afterlife, into a perfect heaven on earth, basically. So that's basically the basis of all revolutionary ideologies, to create heaven on earth. To summarize how Voegelin argues we got here very briefly, so he says that St. Paul basically witnessed the resurrection of Christ. St. Paul believed that, quote, the transfiguration of reality had actually begun and would be completed by the second coming. The book of Revelation also predicted the return of Christ. So St. Augustine rejected this literal interpretation of the revelation in the city of God, and the church basically accepted that conception and that reading of Revelation. But a minority of apocalyptic and Gnostic movements were unsatisfied with this, and from that dissatisfaction came the desire to find a shortcut to redivinize the world, basically, and to turn the world not into just simply an enchanted place again where spirituality was embedded. So if you think of the Greek conception of the world as this ontic logos, we used that term last time, this ontic logos, in which the world was imbued with meaning and in which the world was inherently spiritual and magical, basically, and where the gods inhabited the world. They were all around you. You worshipped nature, basically. Well, he said that wasn't what they were trying to do. They weren't trying to create a pagan religion again, but what they were trying to do was bring about the eschatological return of Christ, basically, to rule on earth, to complete history. So here he says in Order and the Ecumenic Age, Order and History, he says, by the 12th century AD, this inconclusive arrangement had experientially outlived itself. The Western Empire of the Crusades, of the new religious orders, so he's talking about the Augustinian conception, the new religious orders and the cathedral schools of cities in growth and national kingdoms in formation could hardly leave the witnesses of the age unaware that a meaning beyond a mere waiting was being constituted in history. So this is where you begin to get this conception that we're not simply waiting for God to reveal himself. We are actually active participants in the transformation of the world into heaven on earth, and that history has a real meaning, and history is about making this happen. We have to complete this process. Now, Hermetic philosophy holds that essentially that's what mankind's real role is. This is what Hegel believed. This is the basis of Hegel's philosophy, is this. And this is what Voegelin is explaining here, that this began by about the 12th century to become a very widespread belief, and increasingly a widespread belief. And this is what drives the modern impulse. This is the real origin of modernity. And it really comes together in the Enlightenment. So the catalyst for this was, as explained by Voegelin and Loitte. So Loitte argued that from Joachim of Fior, or he's sometimes called Joachim of Flora in Italy, a 12th century Cistercian abbot and mystic, modernity inherited its metaphysical structure through the application of the Christian Trinity to the course of history, which was declared to be in 3 stages, the outcome of which was his eschatological concept of progress in history towards the return of Christ. So this guy was a mystic. He was steeped in Hermeticism too, I believe. And Joachim basically provides, and it's not just Voegelin or Loitte who argued, a lot of other people have argued this. This is actually the origin of the modern idea of stages, of 3 stages. You find this theme of 3 stages culminating in a final age, or a third age, or a new age throughout modernity, in all kinds of religious movements, ideological movements. You'll remember there was, most famously, there was the idea of the end of history as articulated by Francis Fukuyama in the early 90s when the collapse of the Soviet Union happened. So it's a very continuous pattern, and we'll talk about this pattern throughout the series because we're going to be looking at a lot of the consequences of it. But this is where it goes back. This 12th century Cistercian abbot and mystic basically started. He wrote about applying the Trinity, which is also an older symbol. So that can be read not just as a Christian symbol. The Trinity can be seen as a Hermetic thing as well. But we're not going to go into that. But the point is, the Trinity was taken and applied to the idea of history. And this was picked up. Okay, so if you read Voegelin's work in a more extensive way, he actually explains how a lot of these the things like the Trinity, and they actually came to influence later movements. He talks about Auguste Comte and positivism. He talks about Marxism a lot and Marx's earlier influences, and he explains how some of these things and how some of these ideas found their way into modern thought. I'm not really going into all that because that's his work, and it's a rich subject. I'm trying to give you an overview of these ideas and where they come from. So from there, Voegelin basically takes Loitte's kind of Christian theological explanation for the origin of modernity, and he basically argues that rather than providing a Christian theological explanation for modernity, Voegelin argues that Joachim actually provided the first symbol of a Gnostic conception of man and his place in the cosmos. Secularization transforms the Gnostic concept of a true and hidden reality within the human entity into the new worldly reality. So what does that mean? That means that the secularization process is the key crucial difference here. So the Gnostic concept of a true and hidden reality within the human entity, and it transforms it into a new worldly reality. So we're acting in the world. And to summarize further, of Voegelin's ideas. Voegelin labels this a process of immanentization of transcendence, meaning the attribution of the qualities and features of the divine and sacred to the worldly and mundane, and eventually to the human being. So essentially, man is becoming God, man is sacred, and the world essentially is becoming sacred. And according to Voegelin, the outcome of this crossover between what was divine and hidden and what was worldly and real was the emergence of the human being as the new divinity, a process that Voegelin terms redivinization of man and society, man becoming God. So the significance of this is man is now an active participant in the transformation of the world. This culminates in a third age or an end of history. And he explains then how some of this plays out in, this is one of his more famous works, which is another one that I would recommend. It's probably the one I'd recommend people start with. If you want to understand Voegelin's basic thesis on Gnosticism early on in his career, basically, this is the one to read. It's based on lectures he gave in America, I believe. But it is called The New Science of Politics. And he says, as variations of this symbol are recognizable, the humanistic, and he's talking about the Trinitarian application to history here, are recognizable, the humanistic and encyclopedist periodization of history into ancient, medieval, and modern history. So the modern age being the end of history, the third age. Turgot and Comte's theory of a consequence of theological, metaphysical, and scientific phases. This is relative to how people like Comte and Turgot basically viewed science as becoming a hard science and becoming a real science. So they wanted to come up with a science for every kind of aspect of life and make it a hard science. So you could find a theory, a kind of a scientific, hard scientific understanding of human psychology, of spirituality and everything. And we'll talk about that in a later essay. I have a lot written on that already that I'll have to finish up. But basically, he continues here, Hegel's dialectic of three stages of freedom and self-reflective spiritual fulfillment, the Marxian dialectic, which is basic kind of derived from Hegel in many respects, the Marxian dialectic of three stages of primitive communism, the class society, and final communism, and finally the National Socialist symbol of the third realm, though this is a special case in requiring further attention. But you get the idea here. He looks at a lot of these historical thinkers, and he basically says, well, their systems are all very similar, and they all follow this Trinitarian pattern, which he traces back to Joachim of Fiore. So here are some of the Gnostic symbols that Voegelin highlights in his work. He says the Gnostic Superman, this kind of archetypal Superman idea appears throughout modernity and through the work of Carlyle, Nietzsche, Marx, and a few others. And so there's always this idea of creating a new man. And this becomes, as we're going to talk about soon, this becomes the basis of modern education. We have to create a new man for a new society. And then, of course, there's the Gnostic savior or God-man. So he is God. He becomes this powerful figure, the spiritual guru, the legislator, the manager, the scientific expert, or the teacher. The teacher becomes very important. And of course he talks about then the brotherhood of autonomous persons who will be living in the purified society. And he says it can be traced in various degrees of purity in medieval and Renaissance sects, as well as in the Puritan churches of the saints. In its secularized form, it has become a formidable component in the contemporary democratic creed, and it is the dynamic core of the Marxian mysticism of the realm of freedom and the withering away of the state. He is describing the creation of the purified people who have gone through the process of alchemical purification, basically, and they will be the result of this process, this ending of history, the playing out of the chain, the endless chain of being, which kind of goes back to Aristotle. Hegel kind of takes that and through Hermetic thought and turns it into something different. But basically, we're completing this process. Interestingly, which I think is really fascinating to think about, Voegelin highlights the Puritan Revolution in England as the first kind of Gnostic revolution. So that would be the 16 whatever that was, 17th century, and he basically says that that was the first Gnostic revolution. And of course, this goes back to the Reformation and the creation of Calvinism. And of course, it was the Puritans who founded America. And I believe you can really see in American society, you can really still see the retaining of a lot of these Puritan ideas. Now, of course, they've gone through development. They have secularized in many cases. In many cases now, they're not even religious ideas. They are secular ideas. I think a lot of progressive philosophy is rooted in this process. And it's a really fascinating way to look at these things. Of course, some of the things that are associated with Calvinism are things like the construction of a kind of a new society, the overthrowing of the old order, the idea of a special class or a special people, the God's chosen people, basically, which all goes back to the Old Testament kind of ideas, really. Really fascinating to think about, because I think this really affects the Anglo-American world in a huge way. So Joachim of Fiore's application of the symbol of the Christian Trinity to speculations on the meaning and direction of history, now viewed in 3 eras culminating in a final or new age, eroded and later replaced entirely the classical notion that history was cyclical. History was now linear, and having been given a definitive direction, provided to the Gnostic prophet, the legislator, manager, or educator, the obligation to bring about its appropriate conclusion. And I recommend you check out my article, because that's where I go through all that material. It's all sourced and everything, and there's a few more bits and bobs in there, and you'll find it, I hope, interesting. From here, we started to talk about education, because that's why you're here, probably. You're probably interested in where the hell I'm going with this. It's probably obvious where I'm going, but, in the last essay, in part 2, we discussed the Enlightenment in terms of things like utopianism, and we discussed, Helvetius and the French encyclopedists and John Locke and a few others, and we discussed how their ideas about man were incredibly much foreshadowing later developments in psychology and things like eugenics. So the Enlightenment, basically, combination of theory and practice to unleash human self-interest, was essentially, from this argument, basically a Gnostic social transformation process, or at least a kind of spiritual process anyway, rooted in much older kind of occult type literature, really. So the whole concept of progress can be viewed really as a kind of an occult process and a very radical shift in Western thought. It informs utopianism, utilitarianism, capitalism, and socialism. Capitalism and socialism are both revolutionary when you have to think about it that way. I don't get involved in these large scale debates over the legitimate benefits of socialism and capitalism anymore, because I really view both of them as really part of the same kind of paradigm, and we need to be very, very careful that we're not being manipulated into certain kind of dogmatic political positions. So human nature, essentially, then, from this perception, is perfectible, which is also an occult ideology, really. It's an occult way of looking at humanity. Human nature is perfectible, like an alchemical kind of process. The human being is being perfected, like metals, into gold. So focus on man rather than on the transcendent. So that God has now become man. Man is God. And essentially we are not looking at the transcendent, we're looking at creating a new world. Transcendence through matter. The scientific molding of mankind, as in, emerged with psychology and eugenics. And Voegelin describes this process basically as the instrumentalization of the structure of existence. So the very world, the very structure of our being, of that allows us to act in the world, everything is an instrument. You're an instrument. Your mind can be manipulated, your thoughts can be manipulated, your environment. And we're going to discuss how this actually played out, because we can demonstrate how it actually happened. So this idea of social transformation was led by the new middle class. And one of the guys we're going to be drawn upon in this series, who I found a while ago, is an educational historian who is now deceased, called Brian Simon. I'll discuss him in the next slide. Brian Simon argued that this new middle class was the social transformation class, basically, and it drove the whole thing. So it was associated with the Unitarian and dissenting Christians, basically, that came out of the Reformation in England. And they were essentially outsiders to the existing landed aristocracy and merchant families. They were frequently denied entry to the existing academic institutions, which were basically, classical philosophy. And they were denied entry up to Oxford and Cambridge and places like that. So they attended dissenting academies, which these academies all sprung up at this time in the 17th and 18th century in England, Warrington, places like that. And essentially, the Scottish universities, which were separate from the English ones. And so the English radicals basically were from the Reformed Protestant churches and often Scottish Calvinists. And the British empirical tradition continued through social reform agendas rather than earlier arguments about the nature and scope of knowledge. So the early Enlightenment was made up of a number of intellectuals. You want to talk about Hume or Locke or Hobbes, and they're talking about the nature of thought and of human action, and how we define knowledge and man and everything. And then they've kind of worked all that kind of stuff out by this point. So now they're interested in transforming the world and creating a new world and reforming the world. And so this is where you get the revolutionary tradition in the West kind of popping up in a big way. After the Puritan Revolution, after they've ransacked the monasteries and all that stuff, these guys now they have to be reckoned with, and they have now formed a perceptible class in particularly in Britain. So Brian Simon argues that these people this new middle class, were absorbed in the creation of new industrial processes and in developing civic life. They were deeply involved in scientific inquiry and often directly engaged in art and in literature. And we'll talk about a lot of their literature in the next installment of the series, but we'll introduce some of these people again before we do. This is Brian Simon, and he wrote a series of books on British education. I have 3 of his books to hand. One of them is The Radical Tradition in Education in Britain, which essentially republishes a number of what he considers really important texts on education, which includes William Godwin, who we'll talk about, Thomas Paine, who we'll talk about, Robert Owen, who we'll discuss in the next essay, Richard Carlile, Robert Dale Owen, William Thompson, who we will discuss later in the series, William Lovett, who was a Chartist, and William Morris, who we'll discuss in the next essay. That book is interesting. All these books are out of print, I believe. They're all, you have to get them secondhand, but really, really useful resources. He is a Marxist, but he is telling you this is how he understands how we got here. And probably the best one to get is this one called Studies in the History of Education, 1780 to 1870. And that is like a really good summary of this crucial period, basically, where I discussed another series of books in the last installment of the series called The Educational Innovators, which is also very good. But Simon had stuff that they didn't have, and he ties up some loose ends that I didn't understand fully. And another one of his books, which deals with later events, is called Education and the Labour Movement, 1870 to 1918, which you can see it there. That's also very good, but we don't cover that period tonight, so that's for another time. So, he also features prominently, actually, in this new book by Peter Hitchens, called A Revolution Betrayed, How We Egalitarians Wrecked the British Education System, because Brian Simon was one of the main guys. He was at a university in England. I think it was Leicester, I can't remember now, but basically he was one of the main guys pushing for the destruction of English grammar schools and the erection of the comprehensive system. So Peter Hitchens blames him in particular for a lot of that, and the egalitarians generally. So that series of books is absolutely brilliant. His parents were aristocrats, basically. I don't go into their background here, but if you look him up, he has a really interesting background and pedigree. He got the benefit of a very high quality education. He proceeded to destroy that for most people in Britain. Now, his parents were friends of Beatrice and Sidney Webb of the Fabian Society, and they were major activists themselves for comprehensive schools. They sent him actually to the school set up by Kurt Hahn in Germany at Salem, which is a very famous progressive school, and that's where Prince Philip attended. He attended Trinity College, Cambridge, and he became a Marxist. And he had a major affinity for Antonio Gramsci, and you all know who Gramsci is, very important theorist. And his brother was apparently very important in popularizing Gramsci in Britain. So both brothers were active Marxists. Simon was in the Communist Party of Great Britain, and he features prominently in the Hitchens book and as the main promoter of comprehensive schooling. But his books are great, they're very worth reading. He says, speaking about this new middle class that we just introduced a moment ago, he says, "It was to the writings of the great French philosophers of the Enlightenment that they most eagerly turned." So we're thinking about people like Helvetius and people like that who we discussed in part 2. And they also enthusiastically acclaimed the works of Rousseau with their social and educational implications. We discussed Rousseau extensively in part 2. And Carl Schmitt basically explains then of the Enlightenment and of the Enlightenment education. So he says, "For the rationalism of the Enlightenment, man was by nature ignorant and rough, but educable. It was thus on pedagogic grounds that the ideal of a legal despotism was justified. Uneducated humanity is educated by a legislator who, according to Rousseau's social contract, was able to change the nature of man, or unruly nature could be conquered by Fichte's tyrant, and the state became, as Fichte said with naive brutality, an educational factory. So that's what Carl Schmitt is articulating there, is that the Enlightenment inaugurated this desire to basically completely mould the mind of man. And I completely agree. And Brian Simon is giving you it from the kind of Marxian kind of perspective, or the progressive perspective, that, you know, this is he is all in favour of this. This is brilliant. So a very good resource to draw upon. So Simon basically explains that the two people that it really begins with modern education for him are Thomas Paine and William Godwin. So Thomas Paine was largely self-educated. He was an inventor, basically an engineer of sorts. His father was a Quaker, his mother was an Anglican, I believe, and his father was kicked out of the Quakers basically as a child, but Paine was clearly raised with Quaker values. I think that's quite apparent from what I've read about him. His biographers quibble over the extent that his Quakerism influenced his future political writings. I think it's pretty obvious that they influenced him quite heavily, at least, along with Newtonian physics and all this kind of stuff. But basically, he held a deistical view of the world. He was a founding father of America. Americans will obviously know that. And he wrote this book called The Age of Reason, and a few other ones that are very important in Western philosophy and political thought. And basically, he spoke about education in The Age of Reason. And basically, for him, education essentially should be based on science and technology. So he's articulating a modern conception of education. Science and technology ought to replace the dead languages of a classical education. He argued that Christianity had acted as a barrier to scientific advancement and progress, and basically sought to instill this new program of education. And this is inherently linked to the whole modernist project. And then this brings us to the other guy who Brian Simon says is the main kind of, at this point, kind of source of this educational philosophy. And he says it's William Godwin, who was a leading utilitarian. He was the husband of pioneering feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, and he wrote Political Justice in 1793, within a year of Thomas Paine's book. And Brian Simon believes that this was the most thorough articulation of this new conception of education, which was premised upon this idea of the blank slate. The child is a blank slate. All people were capable of being educated if the correct techniques are brought to bear. So the blank slate, this is incredibly significant because this is kind of dehumanizing in many respects, because it robs the person of conscience. So the blank slate, basically, Brian Simon argued that the blank slate found its root in the educational theories of the French encyclopedists, most directly Helvetius, who we discussed in part 2, and in the works of Thomas Hobbes, René Descartes, and of course John Locke, who first elaborated a materialist theory of knowledge, and that was in his essay concerning human understanding in 1689. So Locke spoke about this idea that we talked about in part 2 about, you know, man is essentially pleasure-pain instinct, and we critiqued that under the guise of the philosophy of Voegelin and Isaiah Berlin. And now we're linking it to this more Gnostic kind of conception of man. This leads us to one of the main kind of ways in which this new education was to be premised, and it's psychology. This concept of associationism essentially was an early form of psychology, and it was created by this English guy called David Hartley, who was the son of an Anglican clergyman. And it was essentially the idea, according to Brian Simon, that mental circumstances lay at the basis of the whole theory of human perfectibility. So mental circumstances lay at the basis of the whole theory of human perfectibility. Change these circumstances and you change man. So we're getting here to the idea of changing the environment to bring about particular results, to turn man into whatever you want based on how you train, educate, and socialize him. He inspired the utilitarians, Jeremy Bentham and James Mill. He inspired Robert Owen and the Utopians, and it was considered really the first application of psychology to the realm of education. And we talked about the use of psychology to the realm of education in part 2, and this is very related to that, because it was actually David Hartley inspired that in some of those schools we discussed. He provided a rational explanation of the learning process, and the idea arose that education itself could become a science. This is incredibly significant because education was traditionally considered an art, and viewing it as a science has major consequences for what education even means. So this is worthy of a brief assessment here, because from the Renaissance, you got a very different conception of education. And so this is a brief comparison here, a discussion of Renaissance versus Enlightenment education. So education was formerly an art in the Renaissance, and Desiderius Erasmus and Thomas More were associated with this Erasmian humanism, which was premised really heavily on educating people and creating a very intensive and early starting type of education, which was designed to really turn the individual into a fully autonomous moral actor, basically. And they rediscovered the classical sources, and they emphasized rhetoric as opposed to philosophical logic, and the early teaching of languages of such as Greek and Latin, because it's now proven scientifically that children learn languages far easier when they're really young. So they really observed this, and so Erasmian humanism is a recognized kind of period in education, and it really got me thinking about what education could be if we had that kind of mindset again. This is all about individual conscience, as opposed to the Enlightenment, which is about creating the ideal man, which is a very different thing. So this is from an interesting book as well, which I drew upon, and he explains this like this. He says, central to Erasmus's idea of moral education is the need to inoculate the student against the contagion of popular opinion. In The Abbot and the Learned Lady, Erasmus's spokesperson, the lady, states that the public is the worst possible authority on moral conduct, and that popular custom is the mistress of every vice. Erasmus and More were really aware of the danger of the masses. And in modernity, we live in a time where the masses are heavily controlled. Rather than given a really thorough education which creates individual thinkers and people imbued with a moral conscience, the masses are basically controlled by their passions. And we all are. We're all controlled by our passions. You're given your bread and circuses, basically. And you kind of numb yourself, and you consume your propaganda, and you're fed it on a kind of a continual kind of basis, because it only works if it's fed to you continuously. So Thomas More and Erasmus are trying to inoculate you from that, and they're trying to liberate you, basically, which is what the Enlightenment proclaims itself to be doing. But it isn't really liberating you, I would argue. So this brings us to psychology. So back to Hartley. So this was the emergence of psychology as a discipline, basically, and David Hartley published the Observations on Man, His Frame, His Duty, and His Expectations in 1749, and Joseph Priestley, who was a member of the Lunar Society of Birmingham, published an abridged version of these observations in 1775. So about 15 years later. Priestley was raised as a Calvinist, so we had all that predestination and chosen people and all this stuff. And he turned to science in a young adulthood, basically, and tried to find a rational kind of explanation for a lot of these things. And what he was drawing upon in Hartley and associationism, this is from an interesting book about the Lunar Society called The Lunar Men by Jenny Uglow. It's a great book. She says that Hartley combined physiology with the ideas of Locke and Hume, that far from being born into original sin, the child's mind was a blank, inscribed through sensation and perception, and the association of ideas, hence associationism. At base, Hartley hoped to prove that both our inner and social lives were governed by Newtonian laws, a sort of moral push-pull mechanism. Pleasure and pain were the key. Attraction to good and sympathy for others created happiness, while their rejection caused misery. Self-interest was thus synonymous with benevolence. Social change would spring from the diffusion of knowledge to all ranks and orders of men, to all nations, kindred tongues and people, setting humanity on a trajectory which cannot now be stopped, but proceeds ever with an accelerated velocity. So we're talking here about progress and the belief that understanding the pleasure-pain mechanism, this is now considered the basis of man's behavior and action in the world. This is a totally revolutionary and dehumanizing way of looking at man. So this is one of the buildings that the Lunar Society used to meet in, and along with Joseph Priestley, you had Erasmus Darwin, Richard Lovell Edgeworth, Thomas Day, and all of these men wrote treatises on education, which were developed on the ideas of David Hartley, associationism, the new psychology, and of course Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Romanticism, to varying degrees. I mean, some of them drew more on in the naturalist kind of ideas of Hartley, and some of them, like Thomas Day, would have been more into Rousseau, I would argue, because he was much more of a kind of a romantic type man. Now, we're going to talk about all of those men in the next installment, and we're going to talk about what they actually did. But we'll just briefly kind of just give you an overview of some of them before we log off here. So, Priestley was a teacher, and he wrote the Rudiments of English Grammar in 1761. And he wrote a number of historical and educational writings. He was a teacher, a lecturer at Warrington and Hackney Academies. He was a founder of Unitarianism in England. So Unitarianism, if you don't understand, is like the most really stripped back, kind of loosely Christian kind of religion. I don't even know if you can even call it Christianity, really. I mean, it's essentially just a general belief in God, really. It does not accept any of the accepted kind of church doctrine, basically, and rejects all of that, and basically says that you just basically believe that there is a God, in a general kind of sense, but not in the Christian sense, really. Now, he did a lot of work on electricity, and he was heavily inspired by Jesuit mathematician and astronomer Ruggero Giuseppe Boscovich, who was Italian and Croatian, I believe. And he was convinced that matter was, quote, made up of points, centers of force in perpetual motion governed by attraction and repulsion. So Priestley was a materialist who believed in a creator but not in the Holy Spirit or the divinity of Christ. For him, the brain was just essentially organic matter to be adjusted or manipulated. And so, but this did not mean he was not spiritual. So Priestley really is where you really see that there is a spirituality associated with this, which you actually see a lot of in contemporary New Age type movements, and which we'll come to later in the series. So Priestley says that basically all matter was energy, and thus, in some sense, spiritual. Religion and politics and science swept together around all his experiments, and ideas hovered a shimmering aura of transformation. So it's all about this idea of transformation, this kind of Gnostic transformation. We're going to transform the world and complete history. We're going to bring about this new age through science. And so, and just to briefly introduce some of these other characters, some of which we discussed in part 2, but we're going to discuss there in much more detail in part 4. So Erasmus Darwin is a pioneer of evolution, and he was heavily inspired by Hartley's naturalism, and obviously as a pioneer of evolution, and he wrote a plan for the conduct of female education in boarding schools in 1797. And of course the Edgeworths, so there's an Irish connection here. So the Edgeworths, Edgeworth was a very famous landlord up in Longford, and he was inspired by Hartley's naturalism as well. And he and his daughter Maria Edgeworth, who was a famous author in her own right, wrote a book called Practical Education in 1798, and which would have been based on his work in that school in Longford. And it was, we'll talk a lot about him in the next installment, but it was certainly the most significant contemporary work on pedagogy, according to Brian Simon. And lastly, we come to Thomas Day, who was a close friend of Edgeworth, and he advanced educational radicalism as well, and he was the author of one of the most popular children's books out there for many years, called The History of Sandford and Merton. And he was a real kind of a really eccentric character who his story is kind of funny. We'll talk about it next time. And this is the conclusion of this episode. So I hope this has been interesting. So we've introduced this idea of Gnosticism, how this kind of idea of social transformation that we associated with the Enlightenment in part 2, and the whole transformation of how we view the world from an ontic logos, or from a Christian conception where, you know, you have to have faith in God, who is removed, led to a different kind of reality, basically, coming out of the Enlightenment. And so this new middle class that emerged in the 18th century, in particular 19th century onwards, they were the guys who paved the way for compulsory state education, the creation of human capital for the industrial economy and industrial society, the use of psychology, associationist psychology originally, and scientific methods of teaching. So they moved from teaching being an art to a science. It's about creating a particular type of individual, adapted to the needs of the child in the progressive sense. Child-centered, you hear that term a lot. It's child-centered education. So how do we get this child to learn and behave the way we want? And of course the 18th century utopians and utilitarians were heavily influenced by this, which we'll explain in the next installment. This new middle class was deeply involved in forming the attitudes and behavior of the individual. And it was all about a technical and scientific education, and we'll go into all that soon. So the construction of a new man and a new society, this is the objective, and this is an inherently a spiritually different kind of thing. It's a whole new Gnostic objective, really. It's at least a new spirituality. I would say it is inherently a kind of a Gnostic kind of view in the sense that Voegelin articulated. And that concludes part 3. If you enjoyed this, I would really appreciate if you would subscribe over on Odyssey and Rumble, because you never know where YouTube is going to go. And follow me on X, and I might start using X. I've been talking to different people, and I'm hoping maybe we could do some other things. Maybe I should be doing, it's just this series takes a lot of work to pull together. It's something I feel very strongly about. As it goes forward, it's kind of a slow burn. We just build into where we're going. But it's really going to help us understand contemporary events and how we've really gotten here. We're going to take away a lot of this kind of haze that people live in, and we're going to show you where ideas really come from. So please, subscribe on all of those platforms. Go over to Substack, read the article. There's I put the effort really goes into constructing those articles, and then I base a presentation off of it, so because I know most people won't read a long article like that. But it's all part of a series, so it's essentially just going to keep building and building as the months roll on. So with that, I'd like to say thanks very much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I'll talk to you in the next one. Take care.